viewers, welcome back to my channel. This is Yahua. I'm a first-year PhD student at the University of Melbourne. As I'm a big fan of podcasts, I listen to a lot of them while I'm walking, doing laundry, cooking, or doing workout. I personally learn a lot from listening to those podcasts. In today's video, I want to share with you some of my favorite podcasts that I have been listening to in the past few years. These podcasts cover different kinds of topics, including current affairs, social science, entrepreneurship, culture, and relationship. I will put a timestamp down in the description box for you to check. Personally, I use Apple Podcasts and Spotify to listen to those podcasts. I know a lot of my viewers are located in mainland China, and you may not have access to some of the shows that I'm going to mention today. So it's a little bit tricky. You may need to find a way to climb the wall. So if you know there's a way to find this podcast, I would appreciate it if you can share your experience with others in the comment section. Anyways, without further ado, let's get started. The first podcast I want to talk about is called The Guardian Long Read. It is a podcast that you can also find the text version. Basically, The Guardian is a British news outlet, and they have a column called The Long Read, covering in-depth news reports written by professional journalists, talking about issues like immigration, crime, business, the arts, and much more. So they will select some of the articles and make them into a podcast. In each episode of the podcast, there will be a reader, and that reader speaks quite slowly, so I think you can easily engage with the content. If you can't, just check the text version. Easy peasy. Similarly, the second podcast I want to recommend to you is called The Intelligence, created by The Economist. It is also a current affairs podcast produced every weekday by Economist Radio. It provides a fresh perspective on the events that shaping your world. It has a very interesting introduction saying that for a daily burst of global illumination, you need more than just the facts. You need the intelligence. That sounds very smart. Basically, I subscribe to this podcast is because I like that magazine, The Economist. And in this podcast, each episode has roughly 20 minutes, and you get a snapshot of the issues that affecting the global economy. New stuff, if you are curious about human behavior and social science, the next podcast I want to talk about is called Hidden Brain, which explores the unconscious patterns that drive human behavior. Hidden Brain is a term created by Shankar Vedantam, the host of this podcast, to describe a range of influences that manipulate us without our awareness. This podcast is a little bit like TED Radio Hour. It's well structured and has a very good storytelling format. Another podcast that has a similar style is called Making Sense with Sam Harris. Sam Harris is a philosopher and a neuroscientist, and his work touches on a lot of things like the philosophy of mind, ethics, neuroscience, meditation, and politics, etc. Making Sense is a thought-provoking podcast, and it touches on a lot of controversial issues. The issues that Sam Harris talk about in this podcast are quite deep, which provides you new perspectives on how you would make sense of the world. Alright, if the above-mentioned podcasts are too sophisticated for you to understand, the next one might be easier for you to engage with. How I Built This with Guy Raz, a podcast about innovators, entrepreneurs, idealists, and the stories behind the movements they built. In this podcast, you will hear a lot of interviews and stories, and you will get an idea that how people come up with a brilliant business idea and how they put this idea into practice. You will get a lot of inspirations and motivations from these entrepreneurs' stories. And another reason that I like this podcast is because of the host, Guy Raz. He used to be the host for TED Radio Hour, so I'm very familiar with his voice and his style of doing interviews. In all, this is a well-produced podcast. The podcasts that I have mentioned just now are either American or British podcasts, so I'm going to recommend you some shows that are created by Australian media companies. They do have some good podcasts, and I think it is also a good way to learn Australian English if you are interested. The next show I want to touch on is focusing on women's issues. This podcast is called Ladies, We Need to Talk. It dives into the tricky topics that we often avoid talking about, including things like alcohol consumption, the struggles of monogamy, and the wonders of our vaginas. It's personal, sensitive, serious, and smart at the same time. This podcast is for all the ladies. There's another popular podcast in Australia called Shameless. It's a celebrity and pop culture podcast for smart people who love dumb stuff. The hosts are two young girls in their 20s, and when you're listening to this podcast, it just feels like two of your friends are talking to each other about the latest trends. They update 2 episodes each week. One episode is about celebrity news stories, and the other is about a kind of conversation or an interview with a well-known person. This podcast is produced by an independent media company called Shameless Media, and they also have another production that I really enjoyed, which is called Love, Etc. This one is about love and relationship, and this podcast is also hosted by the same people from Shameless. The first time that I listened to Love, Etc. was back in 2019, I guess, and I finished all of the episodes in the first season. It's fascinating and interesting because they talk about a lot of issues that I didn't know before, such as sugar daddy, all the red flags, cheating, and things like that. In each episode, they have a topic to discuss, and they also engage with individual stories. If you haven't heard of this podcast before, I would recommend you to check the first season because the second and third season goes downhill a little bit. Since we are touching on girl talks, there's another amazing podcast called Life Uncut, talking about all things love, life, lust, and a bunch of other things. Different from the 2 podcasts that I mentioned just now, this podcast is hosted by 2 women in their 30s, so when you're listening to this podcast, you just feel like you have 2 bigger sisters giving you advice on dating and relationships. This podcast is chatty and very funny, and they have this section called Accidentally Unfiltered Stories, where they share people's awkward but hilarious stories. This podcast is informative, down to earth, and very relatable. Go check it if you want a good laugh. Alright, that's all the podcasts that I want to share with you today. Please let me know in the comment section what you'd like to listen to. I hope you find this video helpful, and don't forget to give it a like if you find this useful, and subscribe to my channel. I will see you in the next video. Bye!